Kia ora koutou, everybody. Welcome to the old codgers up the back. Where's the sign?
I don't know, somebody bloody nicked it.
Somebody bloody nicked the sign for the old codgers up the back. Welcome to the young one, gargoyles. The young ones up the front and all us in between. Tonight, democracy, local government. How many people voted? Anybody not?
What?
Anybody going to put their hand up and not? Actually, you might be eaten here. I've been quite involved in the process. I often say to people, I'm a Green member who works for Ruth Dyson as a Labour MP. So I very much live in that space between the green and the red and the progressive voices.
And you vote ACT, is that right?
I act to vote. No. So I thought this is a great opportunity, having just survived the last election, to have Jean come along, because I don't know how many people read her articles in the press about local government, and this is her. We're lucky enough to have somebody in Christchurch for whom this is their academic study, so that's fantastic. And I thought we should use her today. So thanks, Jean, for coming along. You're at Lincoln now? Or
I'm trying.
Because I got growled at for saying you were at Canterbury.
Oh, that's a long time ago.
It was a long time ago, okay, Lincoln University. So welcome to one of our youngest community board people here, our new community board, Callum.
What are you pointing to me there?
Yeah, and John's just the old codger. You can go at the back with the sign. Thanks, Jean.
Right. Okay, well, when I heard from Rosemary, she asked me if I would talk a little bit about the election and particularly around issues in Christchurch. I don't really focus too much on individual councils. I tend to do what's happening for local elections across the country. So I thought I would start off, because I'm a political scientist, I'm giving you a little bit of political science to start with. But we're just going to really talk about the election and some of the stats that have come from it. And then after that, I'm really happy to answer questions, or you might want to have a discussion that's more Canterbury or Christchurch related, because so many people in this room seem to be involved anyway, you might want to talk more about that, okay? So I've got a few overheads, and I'll just run through them, and I've got some...
closer.
Oh, sorry, and I've got some notes because I want to go through some stats with you, but basically to set the scene, I just thought, I just wanted to sort of start off or basically remind you that local elections are part of the local democratic system. So there's two ways that we can officially or legitimately participate in local government, and the first is through free and fair elections that are held every 3 years, and in those elections, of course, you'll know where we elect representatives to our local councils, and we also have so you have the right to actually stand to be a candidate, and you also have the right to vote. And the second part of that local democracy, which is also a legitimate right that you have, is the participatory requirements on local councils to provide citizens with the right to have a say in planning and in significant local government decisions. And I think it's really important to remember that, because so often all we do is talk about elections, and we forget that we have the right to be part of what's happening, and we pay for what's happening at local government level all the time. So, and I know that one of the biggest criticisms for me after the elections that we've just had is that, people express surprise that that so many people don't vote. And my point is that if you're not involved at other times, it's just like a whole world away. It's like something that, what's this about? And I think that if our councils worked harder at having communities involved more, then the elections are more of a natural part of that participation that we have. So that's my point really for starting with that. So anyway, the Local Electoral Act, as you probably know, spells out the process for local elections. The purpose being to set up an electoral process that's flexible and encourages participation through a range of choices that are offered in this legislation. I mean, it's a real irony that when the 2001 Local Electoral Act came in, there was a huge sort of policy process around that. I remember we had a book that came out afterwards, and we had a policy an analyst from DIA who actually wrote a chapter for us on how the Local Electoral Act actually came about, and it was very much based on the fact that, you know, participation was down. How are we going to get more people to participate in this process? And it would be through having this whole concept of flexibility and choice, you know. And so they introduced the idea of having two electoral systems, right? At that time, a new district health board legislation had come through, and government had decided that DHBs would all be run under an STV system or a proportional system. But instead of doing the same for local government, they said, oh no, we'll give councils a choice. They can choose between staying with first past the post or changing to STV. The idea of the other thing that you get to choose is whether you have a ward system in which you vote, or whether you have at large, and that act also brought in the idea that you could have both. So you could have some candidates that represented wards and some that represented the whole district, just adding another form of complexity to the whole thing. We could also have Maori wards, which of course have been, well, I personally think it's quite sad that we haven't really got that off the ground. I mean, there's only about 3 councils, I think, that have got Maori wards. So the whole idea behind that change in the new Act, and well, it's nearly 20 years old now, but the whole sort of philosophy behind it was that if you gave councils and communities more choice, then that actually people would participate more. But that hasn't happened, unfortunately. That's that, and I'll talk about that a little bit more as I go along. But so to think about just saying the STV, there's actually 11 councils in 2019 that use the STV system, and there's only one regional council that uses that. It's the Wellington Regional Council. So there are only 3 councils, 3 areas that where everybody uses STV, and that's Wellington, Kapiti and Hororua. So they vote for the council, the community boards, the health board, and the regional council, all under STV. But everybody else in the country has 2 voting systems to use when you vote in the local elections. Okay. And I'll come back to that as well. So thinking about the 2019 elections, there's several ways to actually cover those, and I'm basically just going to look at 3 things. The first one, most of my time I'll spend on it, but it's really sort of voter interest or turnout, what the research tells us about this and what needs to happen here. And then I'm just going to briefly look at the number of the candidates who stood for election and the diversity of these council candidates. And then I'm just going to touch on the level of political activity or community activity before and during the election. And as I say, after that we can get into local issues. And that's going to be helped by the fact that we've actually got some candidates here, I see, or elected people. So this, it's a bit blurry, is it? Is it clear? Is it all right? Oh, this chart definitely needs an update, as you can see, but this is, the top one is Parliament, voter turnout for Parliament, the bottom one for local government. So it's the, it shows you the difference Parliament, of course, in 2017 went up slightly to 79%, and local government has continued on this sort of downward spiral, and it's about here now, you know. So basically what we see here is the declining voter interest in both central and local government, which of course is pretty much a global phenomenon, but there is very clear evidence that the downward spiral in electoral participation in local government in New Zealand is also related to those legislative changes that I talked about before, and to the structural changes that have happened. Because if you start at the beginning, which is here, 1989 was the year when local government was completely restructured, and we moved from about 5,000 councillors down to what we've now got, which is about 800 councillors, gradually over that 30 years. And nobody can really say we really needed that many, but what happened was that the number of councils was reduced by about 2/3, the number of councillor positions also, and gradually over the last 3 decades that number has continued to drop. We've just got, I think it's about 813 councillors, and when I talk about councillors, I talk about the people that are around the council table, so I don't include community board and local board members. I tend to do my research around the people that actually get to make the decisions, and I don't mean that community boards don't do anything, but I think we do sort of stick with the fact that, you know, who's actually making the decisions here, and there's but you can argue that with me later on, okay? Right. And you can sort of see slight drops in time, you know, and this is of course an interesting one where that 2001 legislation came through here. But looking, sometimes it's a bit of a mistake for us. I mean, it's important to start with this, but it's also a bit of a mistake because there's real differences across the country that a total voter turnout percentage doesn't show us. And so I want to show you that. So if we look at this chart, you'll see that this first one is the metro councils, and that's all the big cities, okay? So that's 2001, 2000, 2013, 2010, 2013, 16, so the last 4 elections. And then we've got the provincial councils, which are...
Does include 2019.
Yep. Yes, it does. Yes, that's this one.
Purple one.
The purple one, yeah. So, so the middle one is the provincial councils, which are the larger district councils and the smaller city councils. So it includes councils like Waimakariri, Selwyn, Ashburton, if we're looking at councils around Canterbury. And this one is the more rural-based councils, like the district councils, like Huranui and Mackenzie. So so it doesn't include the regional councils, okay? So it's city and district councils. It shows you. So what that immediately shows you is that the bigger the council is, the fewer people vote, okay? And turnout tends to be higher in local councils which have smaller populations. So we always say as councils get larger, turnout declines. So councils with the highest level of vote turnout tend to be smaller rural councils that are usually in the South Island. So in 2019, there were 5 councils in the South Island that had voter turnout of more than 60%. Wow. So when you look at that overall total, you don't get that message, you know. So the Chatham Islands had 68.9% turnout.
We've got nothing else better to do.
Yeah. And the first woman elected in the Chathams, I always talk about the woman. Westland District Council had 63.9%, and they've had a very controversial mayor in Westland who got back in by about 100 points, but a lot of the council were cleaned out in Westland. Grey District Council had 63.1% turnout, and the interesting thing is that they have the first mayoral debate for 15 years in Greymouth, because they had Tony Cockshaw before that, and he was just elected unopposed every time because everybody loved him. So it took him to resign to actually have a contest, and look at the turnout that they had. Kaikoura is probably the best story all out. They had 61.4% turnout, and the 8 councillors on that council were all elected unopposed. So that 61.4% came out to vote for the mayoral candidates, who actually went to the wire. You know, I think you probably saw, somebody got in by about 6 points or something, so, and Mackenzie District Council had 60.5. So all South Island councils, if you call the Chathams part of South Island, and Mackenzie has been the highest polling local authority for the last 3 elections. So if we go on to look at the cities a little bit, they're getting little, I know, that I squint at them at home. I'm going to get my eyes tested, I think. But this shows you the city councils, or the big city councils. That's Christchurch, that one there, okay? So, once again, we've got the 4 latest elections from 2010 to 2019. And Nelson, yes, well, I'll tell you why. I'm going to tell you why. Okay, so what tends to happen is that you get major things happen, and that brings the vote up. So if you look at the first one, which is Auckland, 2010, the vote was very high because 2010 was the year that Auckland was restructured and became that so-called super city, a word that they never use anymore. Christchurch, the second one, was also very high in 2010. You'll remember we had that very controversial term, and we had 2 very strong mayoral candidates.
And we had an earthquake.
We did. I personally wouldn't have thought that the earthquake had a great part in it, but we've had that very, very controversial term with some very big decisions made that had been reversed either in the High Court or in the Environment Court, and we had an election where it really looked like the incumbent was not going to get in, and it was the earthquake that actually changed that. We had a real bounce. You see in political science a bounce when you get a big event like that. But what we saw with the research was that bounce was quite quickly petering off, and if the election had been held much later, we probably would have had a different result. But and of course we haven't had the same level of turnout because we've had a much more settled time since we've had Leanne as mayor, so we sort of had more the ups and downs. Turnout rates tend to fall as councils become bigger, as I've already said, due to what we call the increasing representation ratio. Now, a representation ratio is how many voters are represented by a councillor. So, in Auckland, one councillor on the big Auckland Council, they have 20 councillors, one councillor represents 50,000 people. It's huge. Christchurch is the second biggest. In Christchurch, a councillor represents over 15,000 electors. In Wellington, it's 10,000. In Nelson, it's 3,000. So there's your difference. Immediately you can see why. Kaikoura, that Kaikoura that I always like to talk about, 1,600. Every councillor represents 1,600. So the gap between our larger local councils and their communities has grown mainly because people don't even know their councillors, and they don't know, and when local elections come along, it's getting more and more difficult to get them to participate. And I've done a lot of research on this over the years, and you know, I really believe that we should be looking at changing the way that happens, you know, that there needs to be a much more equal, because I don't think Christchurch people get good representation. Like you might have a lot more community boards, and I know that the local government commission, you know, changed the number of councillors based on the fact that you had so many community boards. But it's only if community boards actually get decision-making powers, you know, that, and I don't know how much of that has really changed here in Christchurch. I think there was a good time for a while there, and then it sort of fell off, you know, but you can tell me that, you know. So, yeah, so I think that's all. So let's move on from all the stats, or I talk too much and you want to talk. So what while representation ratios are just one of the factors in voter behaviour, we also know that people vote when there are healthy competitions between well-known and strong contestants, and we've already sort of touched on that. And then there's been considerable controversy around council decisions during the previous council term, and people actually feel in touch with, well, they feel in touch with their council. So they know their councillors. Like you see them in the supermarket on the way home, you know who they are, and you say, well, I wasn't happy about that, or I was happy, or what are you doing about da 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 da. You know, if you already had that of, you know, getting home, you know. Right. So, but what we do know is that turnout is influenced by several things. Okay, so first off, it's the characteristics of the electorate, and that is that whole thing about whether it's big or small, whether it's rural or urban, and what that representation ratio is. It's influenced by voter behaviour, you know, how much voters actually know about local government and what the relevance of local government is to them as a participant, whether they're part of the debate, whether there's a lot of people actually standing. You know, we hear a lot of feedback from people about all that great number of people that stand for district health boards. It makes it really hard to know what to do. But the exception, of course, can be the local issues and the institutions, the institutional arrangements around an election. And that's pretty much how an election is run, and how much information is actually provided by councils and by candidates. So if you think about what happens when you get your voting forms, you know, you get that big fat envelope in the mail and you open it up and it says city council, you know, ward, you know, these are the candidates and you vote for. Community board, you know, these are the ones you vote for. And then there's the regional council. Thankfully we voted for the regional council this time. And then you've got the district health board. Some areas also have licensing trusts, and as I said before, most of those are under first past the post, and then you get to the district health boards. So you have to remember to tick. You know, there's one councillor, so you can only tick once. If you tick more, you've wrecked your voting form. You know. Then when you get to the district health board, you have to think, can't tick, have to rank them 1, 2, 3, 4. You can do as many or as few as you want. So what's happened, of course, is that we have a lot of wasted votes, because people have got, well, first of all, I've got to work out who all these candidates are and whether I'm going to vote for them, and then I've worked my way through, and now I've got to the district, oh darn, I've ticked them, oh, it's in the envelope. So, you know, like, so what we've ended up with is a really, I'm not saying that people can't work this out, but what we get as feedback from voters is that the whole process is just too confusing, too complex for voters. That the whole point of, you know, why we don't have districts for district health boards, I don't know, where you just voted for 2 for your local district. I mean, that I don't know why they brought in that you just voted for the whole lot, you know, and probably because STV works better when you have an at-large system, but it would be so much easier for people to vote if they were just voting for a couple of people for their local district, you know. So what we know, but what's important to know here is that 1/3 of registered voters say they didn't vote in the last elections despite being interested in doing so because they didn't have enough information to do so. You know, they found the whole thing complex. They found the time needed was just too much, but they also found that the way that councils run elections and the lack of information on candidates is a real deterrent to engaging in the process. So, and the fact is that councils take quite different approaches to these elections. You know, every election is run by the local council, so there isn't one overarching body. And I've argued a long time that the Electoral Commission should be in at the beginning of the year telling everybody, yahoo, the elections are coming, you know, and doing a sort of a 6-month education program that local councils sort of come in behind nearer the elections. But the Electoral Commission tell me they're too busy to be bothered with local elections. But 85% of councils actually contract the running of elections out to 2 private companies in New Zealand. And in the past, local councils have done little else except produce that required pre-election report that, you know, people know or don't know about, really, you know. So what's happened in the past is that we've become very reliant on the media to actually find out about local elections, and the media hasn't really been all that interested, you know. Like I've been doing this for quite a few elections, and I get so sick of the media ringing me up and saying, why don't people vote, you know? And I think, oh God, how do you answer that in one sentence? And or who's going to be mayor? And I'll say, well, actually there's a whole lot more to this election than those things. But I have to say that hats off to the media this year. I think they've done a fantastic job around the 2019 elections. You know, like they've had lots of articles, particularly around the issues, and I think that they've really reflected the level of sort of political and community action that's been happening over the last couple of years that has sort of fed into what's happening at local government level. This year, of course, we've also had a bit of change with what councils do. We finally have had an amendment to the Local Government Act that came through in the middle of the year in a little sort of catch-up piece of legislation called the Local Government Regulatory Systems Amendment Act. And that said that local council CEOs are now charged with increasing the vote, which I hope that councils will put into their, the thing, you know, where you approve their pay increases, you know. But anyway, so the Local Government Act now says that the Chief Executive role is expanded to facilitate and foster representative and substantial elective participation in elections and polls. And so that meant that councils are now, we can actually now say to councils, you need to do a bit more, you know, and I think that's really good. And so we've had some quite interesting things happen as a result of that. Like, I wrote a column where I said that councils were really hit and miss about what they did, and the Auckland CEO immediately came back and said, well, we're doing something about it, and really took me on, you know. The one that I think did the best job, though, was the Hamilton City's Chief Executive, a chap called Richard Briggs, and he said he's actually been the most vocal person among them all, and he said, okay, well, we are going to do something about it, because the definition of insanity is continuing to do something the same and expecting a different outcome. So I thought that was a wonderful quote, actually.
That's not from him, though.
Isn't it?
No.
Oh, has he borrowed it?
Yeah.
Oh, right.
So EP.
Oh, right. Well, anyway, I thought it was impressive. This is a council CEO, come on, you know. So.
But he bored it.
Oh, right. Well, anyway, I've given him the benefit of the doubt. But anyway, the council voted $15,000 to run a mayoral meeting. And so they got in some big hotshot from Auckland who ran this really good meeting where I think they had 9 candidates in Hamilton, very good candidates, and they had a packed hall and it was all online. I managed to watch it online, and they've had all sorts of like they've even had a candidate cafe, so the candidates could go along and set up a little booth and be there, and people would come and get a coffee and go and ask the councillors about things that they wanted to know what they were standing. You know, he also did things like he challenged other councils to a vote off, or a lot of these sort of political ideas that we get from the states. You know, some of them started to sort of borrow them about how to increase the voter.
Did it increase the vote in Hamilton?
Yes, but they had a very good mayoral contest as well. Auckland, Wellington's been quite proactive for the last couple of years. They list on their website every community meeting that's happening over the whole area during their campaign period. So they just say, if you're having a meeting, let us know. So you can go on to Wellington's city's website, and they had pages of meetings, so you could choose which one to go to. They had a little contest where you could write on a memo why you were going to vote or whatever, and then they made them into posters. See, that's one from Wellington. That ferry one is on the edge of a bus shelter. So everywhere you went around Wellington, you were sort of getting, it was in your face, this local election's actually happening. Auckland's had a I'm a Voter campaign. They all had T-shirts with I'm a Voter on them, and so you couldn't miss them really, and they've sort of, but it's not just the big councils that have done quite proactive things. The Huranui District Council, just up the road there from Amberley up, they had a really interesting mayoral contest that I'm interested in, because they had 3 candidates for an empty seat and they were all women. That's the first time we've ever had that. So I went up and had a chat to the electoral officer and went to a meeting, which was packed with people. And they, for 2 reasons, the council ran meetings right across the district, because they had a representation review, they had changes in their population, and they changed a lot of their ward boundaries. So they wanted their voters to know that the ward boundaries have changed, that they might get their voting forms and they'd be in a different ward. So they ran meetings, full meetings in all of their areas around the Huranui district, and they also wanted everybody to meet all the candidates. So all the candidates were lined up, and so that's another example of a small council taking a very proactive approach to getting voters involved, and of course they had a good turnout, So the other thing, of course, is that candidates need to do a whole lot more to get their message out there. This idea about writing this, the media will say to me, but all we get is this 150-word piece in a little book. Well, before 2001, you didn't even get that. Candidates would get out and knock on doors, and there would be a lot more community meetings and so on. So the whole thing is that candidates have been encouraged to put their contact details on their advertising or on that little thing. If they've got a website or a Facebook or those sorts of things. And there were quite a few organisations, like one that I always like to talk about is Spin-Off, which is a group of young people who set up a policy local website, and they invited everybody who stood as a candidate to fill in a little questionnaire, and they took on this mammoth task of setting up this whole website, and you could look at it from anywhere in the country at any council and see if the people that you had to vote for had actually put their details in there, and you got a bit more information from that. So I think we need a lot more transparency and accountability from candidates than we've been used to. And the other reason, of course, is that it gets them in the style of how we all want them to work, doesn't it? So, and as I say, councils clearly need to do much more. They need to be much more proactive, and we know that if they are, that actually it works, because in 2016 the Auckland Council actually had a campaign that targeted 18 to 14 year olds, so particularly Pacific Island voters, and they had these little vans with Love Auckland all over them, and just a whole lot of, they spent quite a bit of money on a whole lot of advertising around the elections, and really they were out there in the communities, and they increased the vote among 18 to 24 year olds by 17%, wow, just by targeting that group and having a specific campaign. So, am I running out of time? I'm talking too much. Right. So let's just quickly tell you who gets elected. Right. So I wanted to put up a photograph of the Tararua District Council, which has a woman mayor, and mostly all women on the council apart from 2 men, but I couldn't find it today. So I put up the one that I usually use, which is the old West Coast Regional Council, which has now got 2 women on it. So you can see, it's not that I'm against older men, it's just that we need greater diversity on council. That's how I'm getting. This is what I think the story of the 2019 local election is about. It's actually about the difference we now see on local councils. Okay, so the big changes that have been made have actually been made in the makeup of councils, due mainly to the level of debate that we've witnessed in the lead up to this election. So the whole sort of important catalyst for change has been the growing concern around environmental issues, mainly related to water standards. You of course all know about the gastroenteritis outbreak that happened in the Hawke's Bay, where 3 people died and about 5,000 people were ill, and that was directly related to water standards, and also the declining standards of rivers. I mean, that was sort of like the first step. And then the growing urgency around the effects being felt from climate change events. And the need to deal with these effects has seen campaigns to get councils, as you'll know, to declare climate emergencies. And there's been a surprising amount of opposition to this in local government. In some quarters, there's been still some talk about the science behind all this, and it's really revealed the many older faces that have been making the decisions in local government. And I think the level of debate has been raised because what people have started to do is say, who are the people that are making these decisions? Are they really representative of us? And we've certainly seen youth pushing for these changes. So what we've got this year is that we've actually ended up with probably, and just once again, just dealing with councils, we had 100 more candidates standing for councils across the country, and 75% of them are women. So that's meant that we've ended up with a jump in the number of women elected. They've gone up to 40%, which is a 4% jump. We haven't seen anything like that for quite a long time. I rang Local Government New Zealand, but they still haven't done the regional council stats. But we do know that in the past, regional councils have been largely made up by farmers and people who've sort of retired from city and district council jobs, and it's sort of seen like the retirement step, which is a real shame. I see ECAN's actually got 50% women on it, but I don't think, is that unusual? You would know. They've certainly, there's a lot of councils. there's a lot of councils that have got 50% women, and it's quite exciting to see the changes that have happened. You know, so I'm just going to finish by saying, just to say that while voter interest is similar across the board with some significant exceptions, these clear changes in the makeup of councils and the level of debate, which I hope will continue. I think it's really important that we keep that that going, because and if you want to know why, I mean, I always use this from Colin Copus, who's a UK-based political scientist who's focused on local government. He says elected local government is not a quaint hangover from the past. It's a vital element of a functioning democracy in which central power is balanced with local autonomy and independence, and in which citizens can participate and control those aspects of local political life closest to their interests and concerns. And just one more point, and I'm not going to put up the other thing, but just remember that local democracy, if we just return to my first overhead, is that local democracy is not just local elections, it's also the right that we all have to participate all the way through this period of time that we have a new council, and because councils are required under legislation to actually work openly and transparency. They're required to provide opportunities for people to participate, and that's what we need to be doing. Okay?
Sure. Thank you. And of course, there's the role of groups like the Tuesday Club to keep talking and thinking about these things and asking questions. Any questions?
It's good that we've got the women and men percentage and so on, but I think that our population is now changing demographic, thank you. And that there's a lot more, perhaps, Asians or Pacific Islanders and so on and so forth. Do we have any statistics about the representation plus the population that we have in Christchurch and elsewhere? Because although I think it's good that women are represented, but I do believe that the different cultures around New Zealand need to be represented as well.
And I absolutely agree with you. We don't have great stats on that. The problem is that the Internal Affairs have a local government branch, and they do, every 3 years, they do the stats on the elections, but they don't ask about diversity. They ask, it's actually Local Government New Zealand that does some research, and it's really dependent on whether people reply or not. What we know is that the greatest number of people in the past that have been elected to local government have been over the age of 50. We had about 6% were under the age of 40, very low numbers. The exciting thing, and I meant to say this, is that you'll be aware, we've had a lot of younger people stand for local elections this time, and a lot of them have been very successful, but more than that, a lot of them have actually topped the polls in their councils. So, it hasn't just been that they've stood, and the other good thing that they've done is that we've often had a young person stand around the country in the past, but when they get there, it's a bit like the token woman, the token Maori, the token young person, sort of brought into the fold, but what they've done this time is that the candidate, or the young candidates, set up a Facebook link, and they all sort of looked out for each other during the campaign, and I'm sure they'll continue to do that as the term goes through. And I can't answer your question about diversity, but you would think that with the population projections for places like Auckland of being 50% Asian, that we would have a lot more of them in local government with time coming along. Certainly not representative yet of that, but there's just not enough research done. I mean, there's a little handful of us that do local government research. The political scientists seem to prefer central government's research, but local government's just as interesting.
Cool. One of my, I think I was here, one of my friends in Opotiki is the only Māori mayor in New Zealand at present, and she's a woman, Lynn Restra.
Thank you. I work in the field that you were just asking me questions about. I work in that field with migrant and refugee people. There are over 20,000 Chinese in Christchurch living now, about 12,000 Pacific Island people, mainly Samoans. And the work that for nearly 20 years now I've been doing cultural orientation, which is a whole massive subjects, but one of the subjects is democracy and local government and central government. And I get MPs and local councillors to come in and talk, and it's all interpreted into whichever group I'm talking to at the time, which is very good. But and it's the only place in New Zealand that does this, central government funded. But very few people vote from ethnic communities. There are nearly 200 ethnicities in Christchurch now. And very percentage ratio is very low for voting. And I think we could do a lot more in terms of translated material and things like that, but it's very expensive. And which languages do you choose?
But the culture, like Chinese, would not vote because they don't vote in China.
Well,
You know,
well,
just-
yes, but
They're
but
not
many
used
of those people have been living here for 20, 30 years. And also, it's strange that this should come up, but only today I had a taxi ride down Riccarton Road, and the driver was from another culture, and we got talking, and he'd been here for 4 years, computer programmer, but he was driving a taxi, and he was very annoyed with the state of Riccarton Road, and he said, I wish the mayor would do something about it. And I said, do you like the mayor? And he said, she's one of the best. You know, Jacinda, she's fantastic. And I said, I had to write down the name, Leanne Dalzell, Mayor of Christchurch, for him. And he was articulate, very articulate in English.
Can I just say,
Yes.
just to respond to that, it's very much, I mean, people vote because they feel
Yes,
part of a community.
that's right.
And I mean, you're just taking, you're just showing us that in fact we've got so many
Yes.
communities that in a sense don't feel that.
Exactly.
Don't you think that
Yes.
the terrible events of March showed us a whole community that most of us never even knew
Yes.
was there?
And there's a direct correlation with
Yes.
the Imam Jamal Fuda getting elected,
yes,
with the way that people identified with the mosque. Had that not have happened, unfortunately,
Yeah, true.
he may not have had a profile at all.
You wouldn't have stood.
Yeah.
No.
Thanks, Patrick.
I'm very interested in the middle of that paragraph up there where it talks about the critical power is balanced with local autonomy and independence. It's not just the number of people who vote, but it's also where the resources come from. Local government is a creature of central government by statute, really, and if the money does not flow to the local community for them to make the decisions with, and it comes from central authority, that's very different in terms of what sort of outcomes you might get. Would you care to comment on that?
Oh, absolutely, yes, I would. Because we know that the rates that we pay actually only make up about 70%, 60-70% of what councils need to run their cities or districts or whatever. And so councils are actually quite pushed for cash, you know, and they have a system in local government where you're only allowed to borrow so much and you're not allowed to borrow anymore. We've just had, you know, funding is a huge issue for local councils. And the dilemma that they have is that the more money they get from central government, not that they get much, but they get quite a bit of money from user pays. Christchurch gets money from investments, but there is some things that central government pays for. But, you know, we get confused with accountability once you get into that, because if central government's giving you more money, are you accountable to central government or are you accountable to your local communities? Which is what we want, isn't it, is for them to be. But we've just had a big report done by the Productivity Commission that looked at funding again. We've had, I think, 3 or 4 big reports on funding in the last 12 years. Most of which have been ignored by central government, but the Productivity Commission really pushed central government with the fact that climate change, in particular the effects of climate change, are going to have a huge cost on local communities, and they are going to, I mean, water's a perfect example. We've got lots of talk about the 3 waters idea that the Minister of Local Government's got at the moment. I'm pretty black and white about it. I mean, the reality is that central government have to fund some of the infrastructure in this country, that local councils just can't afford it anymore. And setting up new bodies like 3 waters is just avoiding the whole issue of who's paying for what, you know. But you're quite right, local government lives at the mercy of central government, but it does have a balancing of the power role. If we didn't have it, all we would have was central government. Yeah, we don't want that.
Hi, Jean. I'm a decentralist by persuasion, and I think what I see is an overemphasis on central government in New Zealand. And when you look at some of the big problems, central government is never ever going to solve these big problems, and we see that time after time after time. And the only way we can solve those issues, I believe, is in neighbourhoods and communities. So we need to, from my perspective, we need to put more emphasis. There should be more participation in the local elections than there is in the national election, because really the national politicians are irrelevant to what goes on in our communities.
I absolutely agree with you, and that's one of the sadnesses around how few people vote, because if, you know, like we've just had ECAN return to democracy, haven't we? And no, all of it this time. What I was really hoping was a really strong vote to say to central government, you know, look how many people want ECAN back. You know, well, when I looked at the stats this afternoon for ECAN, I think the more rural-based wards have got 50 plus voter turnout, but the more urban areas are sort of 40 to 50%, you know. And when you've got councils being elected by sort of 35% or 40%, you know, of voters, it does, I think, raise issues around mandates for local councils, and it doesn't help with the central government idea. I mean, the thing is, you probably all know that New Zealand is only one of 3 countries that doesn't have a written constitution. It actually enshrines local government in it. And so central government, although we know it wouldn't do this, can change local government just on a majority vote. And you know, we really do, and I totally agree with you, we do need a form of local government that's, you know, enshrined in local government law, that could only be passed, changed by, you know, the sort of 75%, you know, that you often find with constitutional things. But we've never been able to manage that, you know. But what it means is when you don't have a constitution, you end up with a very strong central government, which works against exactly what you're talking about. Yeah.
There's also an argument for devolving more power to community boards and putting more focus on
there is.
community boards as people are making decisions.
Resourcing.
And this follows on a little bit, and I try to regard myself as well informed, but I must admit I found the voting procedure somewhat bewildering, and my wife and I had to hold each other's hands to work through it. How does that multiply up? You referred to a number of the number of ballots that were invalid because people had done them wrong. Are there any stats on local body ballots that are invalid because of mistakes that have been made in relation to, say, the ballots nationally?
No, I don't know that. I don't know. I do. Occasionally I hear people say, oh, you know, those electoral companies that run, you know, they talk about invalid. We've actually just had that debate in Wellington because you'll recall that Justin Lester, who was the one-time mayor in Wellington, lost by about 60 votes, I think it was, in the STV system. And he was going to have a judicial review because he said there had been so many votes that had been disallowed for something minor. And so he was arguing that, you know, a review of that would make a difference to his vote. But actually, when the electoral company looked at it, it actually would have given more votes to Andy Foster, who won, and so he actually didn't go for the review in the end. But those companies would be able to tell you, you know, it's really.
So it would give some sort of indication as to whether the system needs rejigging, if that's indicating a major problem.
I think that's a good way to finish, really, because I think the Local Government Act, the Local Electoral Act, needs a huge overhaul. You know, it's time. We've got long-term evidence now of, you know, the impact that it is having on voter turnout, and you know, we need to get back to having one electoral system. Well, you know, easier ways of voting. You know, I mean, there's been a lot of debate about online voting. You know, and that local government's been looking at that now for a couple of terms, and in fact, there is actually the legislation allows for it. But the thing is that there's so many questions. I mean, I don't know the goods or bads of it, but I've been to working parties on it, and you know, there's a lot of people that are really concerned about the security around online voting. But it's also quite expensive. Like, there were about 6 councils that were going to trial it this time, and it was going to cost $6.4 million to do it, and the government wouldn't fund it. So they had this big working party that went for about 18 months, did a heck of a lot of work, and then when it came up with, well, this is what it's going to cost, the government said, oh, no, so they backed off it. So of course we've had that debate again with this election about, you know, should we be going to online voting? I mean, I personally think, let's try everything. Let's have a polling booth, a postal vote, you know, all these things. Let's, you know, because some people will use one and another. But I mean, we had the census, the one before last, where you could do either, couldn't you? You could either send it in, or you could do it online, and that worked fine. I'm not talking about the last one, the one before that. I'm talking about the one before that. Oh, you were saying it didn't? Oh,
no, this the one before that was only paper.
No, we definitely. Yeah, you could. I'm sure. Anyway.
So, just another. I found going through. Rod's point is that by the time you got to the hospital board, you know, you're glazed over, even if you set aside a day. And the awful thing, I think, is how many city councillors got on, and I think it's because their name recognition. Oh God, I know them. Okay, they'll be all right. And I don't think they should be allowed to. It's a full-time job being a councillor. Now, do you have any thoughts about that? It just felt like name recognition.
Single person board.
Pardon?
Talk about the single person board. that you are so against?
Yeah. I think just to finish with that, I think the reality is that incumbency is huge in local government, and it always has been. And so people get back on just because they've been there, and people look at that array of names with glazed over eyes, and they go, "Oh, I've heard of him," or "He's been on, so he'll know." And so they do. And I know that sounds negative towards voters, but really, I mean, that's been how it is. The single person ward, Christchurch now has one representative for each ward, which it's a good question to ask, because the representation review, which is where councils decide on these things, you'll be all familiar with that, is that it's based on fair representation and effective representation. So what happens is that councils focus on the fair representation, and that's about every ward has roughly the same number of people. So in Christchurch, most councillors represent about 15,000, and if there's less than that, like in the Banks Peninsula, that's a special situation because it's a big area and so on. But the thing that always worries me is that there's much less emphasis on effective representation, and when you look at the defining of effective representation that's happened with different things that we've done in New Zealand over time, thinking particularly of the Royal Commission on the electoral system that we had before we changed to NMP, the central government, they defined effective representation as having choice. And if we're talking about what you were talking about having diversity and whatnot, that if you have the ability to vote for 2 people or 3 people, you're more likely to go, well, I really want a woman, and I really want somebody from the Indian community, but I also want him because he's been there before and he's experienced, And so, in fact, it gives voters more choice. Whereas if you get one person, you don't have any choice. You can only choose one person, And so I don't think we have enough emphasis on the effective argument versus the fair argument.
Does STV address that, in your view?
STV actually helps the ones that don't normally get elected, because you will vote, because you rank the people. You're likely to go, well, I really want that person, so that person's number 1, but I really like to see that person in, so I'm going to give them 2 or 3. Like, you'll see people under an STV system as say, give me my number 1 and give him or her number 2. So people will actually campaign along those lines. Now, we haven't had much research on the impact of STV in New Zealand because so few councils have used it, but we have got some research in Dunedin, because they have STV, that shows that women are doing better under STV. But you have to have that. It's not as straight. I mean, there's also complications with it because it works better if you've got an at-large system, and that's why district health boards went at-large. But that's not always been either. So
There's going to be another representation review coming up, isn't there?
Not for a couple of years.
Not for a couple.
Yeah.
We're going to have to stop because I think it is this term.
Yeah, but it won't be this year. It'll be the start in 18 months sort of thing.
It's after 7, so we're going to.
Oh right. Okay.
Just remember the queue dropped these around. Gary mentioned the sale that was coming on. A good group to support. If you didn't get one of those, they're around on the tables. Thank you very much, Jean, for restoring the democracy of Christchurch. This is the people's democracy of Christchurch. This is a great theme for us to be discussing. So onwards and upwards. Thank you.